Good evening, and thank you, Professor Kaur, for inviting me to speak at his foreign policy certificate course. I can see, that there is, I would say, the lineup of there is study speakers. So I think, I'm very fortunate to be part of that particular gathering. So the topic today is India's cyber diplomacy, and it is actually part of my book, which has come out recently from Redtage, Securing India in the Cyber Era. As we would see, I mean, as we have been seeing for the last 2 years, the advances in information and communication technology has really brought the world closer together. They've also created opportunities for many people who could not, utilize the opportunities earlier. But at the same time, they've also created challenges. We have seen, for instance, the spread of disinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic. We've also seen the ways in which the states are carrying out the cyber attacks and how they are exploiting the vulnerabilities in other countries' computer networks, and that has really made cybersecurity a really an important subject, which is why because of that importance of the subject of cybersecurity, the the importance of international collaboration has also expanded because cyberspace knows no boundaries, and therefore there is also a concerted attempt being made by the states to engage on the cyber issues at the diplomatic level, both bilaterally as well as internationally, so that they can actually make an attempt to tackle some of these cybersecurity threats. Now, the uh, the urgency of doing diplomatic collaboration is also reinforced by the fact that cyberspace is one of those global commons which has really no central governance framework. If you look at, for instance, the fact that in some other areas you have certain international institutions which are regulating that particular sector, such as, for instance, the World Health Organization for the health sector, and then so on and so forth. In the cyberspace, we really don't have that kind of governance framework, and that is why the urgency for collaboration really becomes important. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly, because I have half an hour, I'm going to basically speak about the geopolitics of cyberspace. Then I'm going to look at the India's initial engagement on cyber issues. Then what kind of contribution India has made in shaping the cyber norms. Then India and the issue of internet governance, how the internet and cyberspace is managed. Then also looking at the bilateral cyber diplomacy in the form of the cyber dialogues with the like-minded countries and partners, and also looking at what kind of cyber capacity building efforts India has undertaken in parts of Indo-Pacific as well as the African continent, and finally what has been India's contribution in the promotion of the digital economy. So, looking at the geopolitics of cyberspace, one thing which really becomes clear today that earlier, whereas the cybersecurity issues, used to be confined to confined to at the individual level, today actually you have geopolitical rivalries spilling into the cyberspace. Countries are making use of cyber warfare to actually hit out at their adversaries, and nowhere this is on display prominently than currently what is happening in Ukraine, where before before the Russian military invasion began, Russia-based hackers and Russian state-sponsored hacker groups launched a series of cyber attacks on Ukraine, which crippled Ukraine's computer networks as well as ministries as well as various other websites. So countries are now really learning to use cyber technology as well as cyber tools to achieve their geopolitical objectives, which is why now attacks targeting the national and commercial computer networks have really become like new normal in the cyberspace. Many of the major powers today have dedicated cyber units with which they can actually target their adversaries. Uh, and one thing which is really unique about the cyberspace is that uh, while there are states which are carrying out the cyber attacks, you also have non-state actors also carrying out the cyber attacks. So non-state actors such as the cyber criminal syndicates, then as well as the the organized hacking groups, they are also carrying out attacks. And sometimes what is also happening is that states are actually using these non-state actors for carrying out the cyber attacks. So they're actually outsourcing this work of cyber attacks to these private non-state actors, and that has really blurred the distinction between the state and the non-state actors in the cyberspace. And therefore, that has really made cybersecurity issues one of the critical issues of international security. Now, over the last 2.5 decades, since the late 90s, uh, the United Nations has made a concerted effort to tackle these cybersecurity issues at the various forums, including in the first committee on the international security and disarmament at the United Nations General Assembly, as well as the International Telecom Union, which is one of the associated agencies of the United Nations. They have really done some work in tackling the cybersecurity issues. But but what is happening is that the enormity of the challenge is such that these attempts to tackle these cybersecurity issues are really getting inadequate. Which is why now the states are also resorting to the bilateral cyber diplomacy. Uh, Besides, as with any other domain in international security, uh, developing cooperation in the cyberspace has really become the casualty of the great power differences. So, on one hand, you have certain states which have a different vision of how they look at the cyberspace. There are other group of countries which are also looking at the cyberspace differently. So, for instance, if you look at the cyberspace, there are various stakeholders. There are state actors, there are technology companies, there are human rights activists, there are also the businesses, the private sector. So some states, like the United States, have a multi-stakeholder model, a multi-stakeholder approach to cyberspace, where they're saying that not just the states, but all the other stakeholders who are operating in this cyberspace do have a say in the management of cyberspace, which is why the multi-stakeholder model. Uh, but there are countries such as Russia and China, which have a very state-centric vision of the cyberspace. They feel that yes, there are that there are states and non-state actors in the cyberspace, but when it comes to managing the cyberspace, the states should have the only voice in doing that. So states should, because the states have the capacity, therefore states should be the only ones who should be managing the cyberspace. So, so there are these two competing visions of cyberspace management, which are really at the heart of the efforts to create some kind of a regime when it comes to governing the cyberspace. Now, it is in this background that India has really positioned itself as an emerging economy with a very sophisticated technology industry. Now, as you would have seen in the previous lectures, since 1947, India has been an active participant in the global debates on international security issues, which was evident from its advocacy of the universal nuclear disarmament. Right since 1947, right after independence, Prime Minister Nehru took it upon himself to discuss the issues of nuclear disarmament at the United Nations and other multilateral forums. Uh, and while India did not become a part of the nuclear non-proliferation regime, which came about in 1969 after the signing of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, uh, India always abided. India always followed the spirit of non-proliferation, both in spirit as well as in principle. Now, India has carried this legacy of being an active player of cyber and digital issues. Uh, this engagement began right in the late 1990s when internet was introduced in India. In fact, for many Indians, uh, the internet really offered an opportunity to connect with the outside world at a time when the access to the outside information and to the outside world was still restricted. So I remember at a time when in the early sometime in the late 90s, I think around 96, 97, when I got my first internet router, the modem, we were so happy that that we could now chat with anyone out there in the world who was on the internet. We could send emails to my cousins in New York and those kind of things. So that really, kind of gave a sense that the internet really brought the Indians closer to the world. The Indians they really brought together. Now, given this interconnected nature of the information superhighway that is the internet, uh, there are many countries which did want to regulate and at least this particular cyberspace, because early on they realized that while internet is bringing the world closer together, at the same time it does need certain rules, it does need certain regulations, so that the internet can be better managed. And India, because it was emerging as also a software industry at that time, as a software giant at that time, with companies such as Infosys, Wipro, HCL, and so on, India was also eager to join these efforts to manage the cyberspace. Uh, However, this enthusiasm was also, in a sense, somewhat, I would say, nascent, because even though India wanted to play a role in the management of cyberspace, the policymakers, which is the diplomat as well as the government officials, really did not have a technical knowledge of this subject. So India's initial positions at the various multilateral forums really came from its understanding of the arms control and disarmament issues, and that understanding was applied to the digital and cyber issues. So at that time, there were multilateral forums such as the International Telecom Union, as well as WSIS, which is basically the World Summit on the Information Society, which was a United Nations sponsored initiative to look at the cyberspace. So both at the ITU as well as the WSIS, India really kept a low profile, because the Indian diplomats really did not have the technical knowledge of the subject. But as I said, India did bring its understanding of the issues of nuclear technology as well as the arms control and disarmament to this particular domain. So therefore, India's initial position was that, uh, because it was acutely aware of the kind of divide which had emerged in the nuclear technology, for instance, that there were certain countries which had access to the nuclear technology, and there were other set of a large set of developing countries which were denied access to the nuclear technology. A similar kind of technology divide may arise in the cyberspace also. Therefore, India, in the initial years, highlighted the position that uh, countries should have unfettered access to the and communication technology, because this is a technology which is critical for economic development. That was India's initial position. Now, India really got an opportunity to shape the global norms on cyberspace, to frame the rules about the cyberspace, when the United Nations set up what is known as the GGE process, which is the group of governmental experts process. So, group of governmental experts basically brought uh, technical experts from each of the member country, and they actually deliberated on the issues of what kind of rules will be applicable, uh, when kind of applicable to the emerging order in the cyberspace. And India was actually part of the first GGE, which was set up in 2004, and India has been part of the GGE process since then. And in fact, India was also part of the GGE process, which the latest being the GGE 2019 and 21, which concluded last year. So India really got an opportunity to shape the global understanding of the cyberspace. So one of the first things which India highlighted at the GGE was the issue of cybersecurity and cyber terrorism. And that again came from India's own experience on cross-border terrorism, and how, for instance, Pakistan-based terrorist groups were hitting out at India, and therefore India really uh, uh, brought forth the issue of responsible state behavior in the cyberspace. India really did not want that the kind of irresponsible state behavior which was evident in the cross-border attacks coming from Pakistan, that should not be replicated in the cyberspace. So India highlighted this norm of responsible state behavior in the cyberspace, and it also said that uh, if there is a cyber attack, then countries should have the right to self-defense against these state-sponsored cyber attacks. So again, an understanding which was framed by its own experience of the cross-border terrorism, that India said that whenever there is a state-sponsored cyber attacks, uh, the countries should have the right to self-defense. But India was not one of the only. India was one of the only few countries which did talk about this issue. But there were other countries which had a different understanding of the issue, and overall, these differences meant that it really became difficult for the GGE process to evolve a consensus on what it means to be a responsible state in the cyberspace. What kind of rules should be there for the responsible state behavior in the cyberspace? Uh, because India highlighted the issue of cyber terrorism, India also became signatory to the Christchurch Call to Action of May 2019. Now, this was basically a call which was signed after the Christchurch terrorist attack in New Zealand on 15th March 2019, where a shooter had killed many worshippers at a mosque in Christchurch. So, and then he had actually live streamed that act on Facebook. So, Christchurch call to action basically makes it, what should I say, puts some commitments, voluntary commitments on the states as well as the online service providers and social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to really address this issue of terrorist and violent content on the social media platforms. So India was signatory to this particular Christchurch call to action. Uh, Overall, if you look at India's positions at these multilateral cyber forums, one thing which is evident is that it actually reflects the pull and push of various issues. So, on one hand, you have the pull of economic development, which is that in opportunities which are coming from the cyberspace. For instance, there is the issue of the free data flow. So India believes that it stands to benefit from that free data flow, and therefore that is the pull which is affecting its posture at the international level. But at the same time, there is the push of the national security issues faced with the constant cyber attacks coming from China, Pakistan, and some of the other non-state actors, as well as its own experience to cross-border terrorism, India believes that there are certain restrictions which need to be put on the cyberspace. So that is the push factor. So on one hand, you have the pull of economic development. On the other hand, you have the push of the national security concerns, and that, in a sense, it reflects uh, the position of the developing countries as such, where they do want to benefit from the opportunities which are coming from the cyberspace, but at the same time, they do have certain national sovereignty considerations when it comes to cyberspace. Which is why, if you look at India's cyber diplomacy, it is actually a combination of multilateralism and national sovereignty considerations. Uh, and again, this position of multilateralism and sovereignty uh, aligns with India's position on the nuclear issues also. That on one hand, India wanted the was championing the cause of the universal global nuclear disarmament, but at the same time, it was not willing to give up the nuclear weapons till everyone gave up the nuclear weapons. So there was that emphasis on multilateralism, that about the global nuclear disarmament, and at the same time there was the concern of sovereignty, which is that India will not give up its nuclear weapons till the time everyone agrees that they will give up their nuclear weapons. Uh, so that is how India shaped its cyber diplomacy. And one thing which is also evident from India's positioning at these multilateral forums on cyber issues is that largely speaking, India has aligned itself with the Western world when it comes to the cyberspace issues. But at the same time, there are certain issues on which India has taken a very unique position. One such issue is the issue of data localization, which is why, whereas every developed country is emphasizing that there should be a free flow of data, India has taken a position, in fact, a position which opposes this argument and said, that there should not be a free flow of data. In fact, certain forms of data should not flow freely. They should be stored on the national territories, which is known as the data localization. That certain elements of data should be stored locally. And in fact, the Reserve Bank of India has taken this position that certain elements of the payment data, the kind of payments that we make on Paytm and through the credit cards such as Visa or Mastercard, all that data should be stored locally in India, because RBI believes that it will need that kind of data for cyber criminal investigations. When there are cases of economic frauds, India will need access to that data. So rather than approaching the foreign governments and the foreign companies for getting access to that data when there is a cybercrime, India can actually save itself from that particular effort by having that data stored locally and therefore getting access to that data. Now, this position, which is known as data nationalism or data sovereignty position, runs contrary to the Western position, both American as well as European, which have been emphasizing this position about the free flow of data, which is why at the G20 summit, the group of the 20 most industrialized nations in the world, the group of 20 or the G20, at its summit in Japan in 2019, actually signed a declaration known as the Osaka Tract for Data Governance. And India was the only country which actually stayed out of that particular track, because it said that it is opposed to this kind of free flow of data and emphasizes data localization. So that is really, in a sense, it's a very niche position which India has taken. Uh, Now, apart from the group of government experts process, India has also been a part of various civil society initiatives as when it comes to cyberspace. So, for instance, in 2019, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres had actually formed what is known as the Secretary General's High Level Panel on Digital Cooperation, which was basically looking at what kind of collaboration the countries can form when it comes to the cyberspace as well as the digital technologies. And that particular panel was headed by Jack Ma of China and Melinda Gates of the Gates Foundation. Now, India was represented at that particular panel by Ambassador Amandeep Singh Gill, who was the secretary of that particular panel. So India has been part of such high level efforts also, and at the same time, India has also supported some of the non-governmental initiatives when it comes to the cyberspace management. For instance, uh, India has supported the Talin Manual. The Talin Manual is basically a manual which has been set up, a document which has been brought out by the NATO when Russian cyber hackers targeted Estonia in 2007. And since 2007, NATO has been working with the Estonian government to basically bring out a set of legal opinions uh, that actually present options to the state when it is faced with cyber attacks. So India has actually participated as part of those consultations for the Tallinn manual. And it's also supported the Global Commission on the Stability of the Cyberspace, which is another attempt by the civil society to shape some norms for the responsible state behavior. So India was represented at this particular forum by former Deputy National Security Advisor, Ambassador Vijayalatha Reddy, and Dr. Samir Saran of ORF. So these two commissioners participated in this global commission on the stability of cyberspace and contributed and brought India's perspective on the cyber issues. So India has supported such non-governmental initiatives also. Now, when it comes to the internet governance, one thing which is clear is actually that, as I said, that India really aligns itself with the Western notions of the cyberspace management, which is that the fact that India actually supports the multi-stakeholder model for cyberspace management. So that position actually is and it has in a sense what should I say, has undergone change. So initially speaking, when India's knowledge about the cyberspace issues was somewhat limited, India actually supported the Russian and Chinese position, which is that only states should be the actors in the cyberspace management. But sometime in 2015, that position changed, and then India actually adopted the position of multi-stakeholder model, which went against the Russian and Chinese position. But having said that, actually, India has also attempted to convince both Russia and China to support the multi-stakeholder model, and with some success, I would say, because if you look at, for instance, the joint statements which are coming after the BRICS summit, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa grouping summit, the BRICS summit, uh, between 2015 and 2018, the joint statement figured had featured the issue of the multi-stakeholder management of the cyberspace. So even though Russia and China, were opposed to this particular notion, uh, the diplomats agreed that this terminology should feature in the joint statement of the BRICS, which in a sense signifies, that India has been successful to convince the Russian and Chinese diplomats the need for adopting such a posture. And then there are cyber dialogues with like-minded countries. So the Ministry of External Affairs in recent years has set up what is known as the Cyber Diplomacy Division to focus on the cyber issues, and that really gave a significant impetus to the bilateral cyber engagement. Uh, in the last 2 years, India has held dialogues with more than 15 countries and two organizations, the European Union and the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So if you look at the particular table, India has bilateral cyber dialogues with a couple of these countries, as well as MOUs with many countries, and even the technical agency, which is known as CERT, which is known as the Computer Emergency Response Team. So every country has this particular technical unit called as CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team, and that particular unit of India, the CERT India, has also done many foreign collaborations with countries such as South Korea, Japan, Mauritius, and so on and so forth. But apart from that, India has also participated in the technical forum. So Interpol has one forum in Singapore, which is basically the Interpol Global Complex for Innovation, which is where it does a lot of cyber criminal investigations. And India has been an active participant at that particular technical forum, as well as India is also part of the Asia Pacific CERT, which is the grouping of the computer emergency response teams from Asia Pacific. So India has been doing these kind of cyber dialogues with these countries. Now, one major observation that I have here in these terms of cyber engagement is that uh, this cyber cooperation or cyber security cooperation is actually part of the broader security collaboration between the two countries. And therefore, in cases where India already has a very robust security collaboration, India has found it easier to engage in the cyber security collaboration. Uh, and one notable instance of this is the India-US cybersecurity collaboration. Now, since the 2008 Mumbai attacks, India-US security collaboration has really thrived with intelligence sharing, with counterterrorism exchanges, with defense trade between the two countries. So that has really taken the India's US cybersecurity cooperation to the next level. Now, that particular collaboration has actually paved the way for India-US cybersecurity collaboration. So in 2016, India and the US signed the cybersecurity agreement for cooperation, and that was the first agreement for India on the cybersecurity front with any country. And now what has happened is that because of this cybersecurity collaboration with the United States, India has found it easier to work with the allies of the United States to take forward this cybersecurity collaboration. So the three notable instances in this particular case are Japan, Australia, and France, all the allies of the United States. So with Japan, for instance, we are looking at robotics as well as other kind of emerging cyber technologies. With Australia, we're looking at robotics, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. And with French, we are looking at quantum computing and artificial intelligence as part of the broader cyber collaboration. So that has really, taken India's cybersecurity engagements forward. And particularly with Australia, I think in the last 2 years there has been much expansion of the cybersecurity collaboration, and that's also primarily because India's vision of a resilient cyberspace matches well with Australia's vision of cyber diplomacy, which is why now both the countries are actively promoting research on cyber and other emerging technologies, whereby they are giving multi-million dollar grants to the researchers in India as well as in Australia to explore some of these issues at the level of academics as well as at the think tanks. Uh, Both the countries are also actually looking at the resilient cyberspace in the Indo-Pacific. So, therefore, India is helping countries like Bangladesh, Tunisia, and Vietnam to really uh, do some kind of capacity building in cyber criminal investigations as well as cyber forensics. Because one of the things which has been brought out by the experience of these smaller countries is that even they are becoming victims of the cyber crimes, but they necessarily do not have the technical capacity to investigate those cybercrimes. And given the fact that India is also developing its capacity in these particular domains, India is more than happy to share its technical knowledge as well as expertise as well as best practices with these smaller countries to really do their to really build their capacity. Uh, but besides the bilateral diplomacy, India is also utilizing some of the multilateral forums to do the capacity building. So there is a forum called as a Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, which is where India is looking at sharing its knowledge on the cybersecurity issues with the other countries in terms of the best practices, in terms of technical standards, and those kind of things. And one last thing is about the India's development diplomacy, which is basically run through what is known as the ITEC program, Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program. Now, in the last few years, as part of the ITEC program, India has also introduced cybersecurity cooperation as one of the focus areas of the ITEC, which is where now many of the participants of the ITEC forum, which come from Africa as well as some of the other countries in Southeast Asia as well as Latin America, they actually get an opportunity to train with the technical government institutions in India, such as the Indian Institute of Technology at Kanpur, Indian Institute of Technology at Kharagpur, as well as IIT Delhi, to really look at cybersecurity issues and get some training on the cybersecurity issues. So India has also utilized its domestic capacity, technical capacity, to actually expand its cyber diplomacy and as well as engagement with the countries in Asia as well as Africa and Latin America. You can see actually this particular photo which I've shown here is actually the batch of the ITEC program at one of the cybersecurity centers at IIT Kanpur. And finally, looking at the digital economy. Now, I think in terms of the digital payment systems, India has been one of the world leaders because we have one of the most evolved digital payment ecosystems in the world, where we are seeing an increased usage of not just the credit cards but also our own domestic innovation, digital innovation known as the Aadhaar-based payment systems and what is known as the UPI, which is a unified payment interface, which is basically an Indian invention. Now, India is actually, is eager to take this particular invention to other countries which are also looking at the financial inclusion. Where, for instance, there are many people who don't have access to the formal financial systems as well as banking system. So India is eager to share this particular technology to some of the other countries in Africa and Asia Pacific, which is why it is also looking to export this particular technology. And there are many countries such as Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Morocco, which have actually expressed interest in utilizing this India Stack model or the UPI model for their own financial inclusion. But also looking at the not just the UPI, but also the Aadhaar itself. Uh, Even though there is a debate within India in terms of the compulsion on Aadhaar and those kind of things, India has offered this particular technology of a foundational ID program, a digital foundational ID program that one ID will serve many purposes, including the delivery of the citizen-centric services. India is eager to export that particular technology also to some of the other developing countries. And again, there are countries which are looking at this particular ID program because they also want to digitize their citizenship records and those kind of things, but are struggling with the technology. And because India has already successfully executed this at the level of 1.3 billion people, uh, it has been stress tested during the pandemic also. It has been stress tested during the vaccination also. Some of the other smaller countries are actually are eager to utilize this technology for their own national ID programs. And uh, that has really made India a major contributor to the shaping of the global digital economy because India's experience and India's technical knowledge is finding resonance with some of the developing countries which are eager to get on the digital bandwagon but necessarily do not have the financial resources to afford the American or the Japanese or the European technology. And therefore, India, with its low cost and advanced tech model, is actually offering that particular solution to many of the developing countries, and therefore contributing to their domestic development. To sum up, I would say basically, that today, if you see, actually, the world is divided into three blocks. Uh, One block which is led by the United States, which is focusing on the big tech block, which is that social media companies and the technology companies are dominating the digital issues. Then on the other hand, you have the European bloc or the EU bloc, which is focusing on the regimes such as the data protection or the GDPR regimes. And on the other hand, you have the third bloc, which is the Russia-China bloc, which focuses on the state-centric model of cyberspace. And within these three blocks, India can actually offer a bridge with its own unique experience of being a part of the developed world with its IT industry and its experience, its innovations in the digital sphere, and at the same time being part of the developing world, where where you would still have problems with low internet speed as well as some of the other problems associated with the digital infrastructure. India can actually bridge these three blocks to advance its own vision in the cyberspace. And India has 700 million internet users, so they also have certain stories to share in terms of their experience of getting of their first time experience on the internet. And therefore, I think India can actually become that bridge of international cooperation at a time when you have really polarized international system. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sameer. The book that you have written, I think, explains everything that securing India in the cyber area. I think it should be a wonderful book, and I will expect the participants also to go through it. And now, before I open the house to the participants for questions, I have a small query about the storage of data. India insists that data should be stored in India itself. And international companies, they are not agreed. So India's worries can be, I think, understood. What is the hitch on the part of the international company who don't want to have that the data stored in India? What they do fear?
So there are a couple of fears. One is that you must have heard about this often quoted phrase, which is that data is the new oil, right? So there are countries which are actually utilizing this data, monetizing this data for their own business purposes, which is what many American companies do, which is why they have the data centers based in North America as well as Europe. So there is a fear, that they would actually lose out on that kind of data, and we have to admit the fact, that whatever kind of data that these foreign companies generate, uh, if the data gets localized in India, they actually would have access only to the European data and North American data, which by its sheer size will not be too much for them to process and get monetary benefits from. They're actually looking at the data coming from the developing countries such as India, from African continent, as well as from China, to actually enhance their business prospects. So they actually have an objection to that, which is that uh, they would actually lose out on that kind of valuable and what should I say remunerative data. But they're putting this under the guise of cost, which is to say that they're saying that, look, we have already set up the data centers in North America and Europe, so why should we now be spending to set up a data center in India because the national laws require it? So they are actually fearful of the fact that they would actually lose out access to this data and therefore their business opportunities. But they are presenting it as a cost argument to say, that it doesn't make a business sense for them to spend that much money to set up a data center in India and comply with the data localization norms of the Indian government.
Thank you, Dr. Sabir. I mean, for explaining this is a vital issue. I mean, it's a debatable issue these days, and we read it with interest. Why India insists on it, and why the Westerns oppose it.
And in
So
fact,
now
I should add here, that, and despite the pressure which has come from the American government, I think Indian government has stood its ground in the last 2 years. In fact, now if you see, uh, there are two American companies which have been penalized for not complying with this data localization norms. One is the Mastercard, and the other is Amex, both really powerful American financial companies. They actually have been penalized by India for not complying with the data localization requirements.
So that's there. And now I ask the participants to put their queries to Dr. Samir. Yes, introduce yourself and put the questions in a brief and simple manner. Come on.
Good
Be
evening,
quick.
sir. Uh, Hi. Good evening, sir. My name is
Yeah, yeah.
Pranjal, and I'm doing my master's in IF from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Missouri. So my question is, as you have mentioned, that cyber attack has surged in the last few years, and even in this Russian-Ukraine war, we have seen several incidents of cyber attacks and misinformation campaigns. So how these trends are going to affect the future warfare, and where India stands in its readiness to counter such attacks?
Thank you. So actually,
Yes.
that's the topic of my book. Actually, securing India in the cyber era. But India, I mean, we have been seeing these kind of things for a very long time. In fact, as I said, in 2007, it was the first time that we saw how Russia used the tool of cyber attacks to target Estonia, with whom it had a geopolitical dispute. And one thing which we have seen since then is that many countries are actually learning from that particular experience and shaping their responses. So when Estonia was hit by the cyber attacks, Russia studied the reaction of the West and saw, which areas there was a reaction and in which areas there was no reaction. So that's why, it made these cyber attacks as a part of its hybrid warfare strategy and went on attacking some of the adversaries. So 2007 was followed by Estonia was followed by in 2008 by a cyber attack on Georgia. Then we had repeated cyber attacks on Ukraine since 2015, and now we saw a culmination of those cyber attacks just before the Russian military invasion. Similarly, also looking at the Russian example, we had United States and Israel targeting the Iranian nuclear program through the Stuxnet virus, as well as the Chinese also targeting India, as well as United States, as well as some of the European countries through cyber attacks. Now, if you look at India, I would say, that sorry, so just on the global cyberspace, I think where are we going is that probably now we will enter a phase where you will actually see these cyber rivalries peaking, and that actually would bring us to a stage where states might just decide, that these kind of retaliatory cyber attacks are not taking them anywhere. In fact, it is only giving them a tactical advantage as compared to a strategic advantage, which might force them to come together on a global understanding and some kind of a cybersecurity agreement. That's my hope when I look at these repeated cyber attacks. Now, if you look at India, I think India has been facing these cyber attacks for a very long time. In fact, in 2015, we saw a very deeply penetrating cyber attack coming from China. And what we saw is that that particular cyber attack was targeting the Indian government institutions as well as companies, looking for information such as India-China border relations, India's relations with South Asia, as well as Indian naval activity in the South China Sea. So that particular threat vector was looking at that kind of information. And what we also found out was that that particular threat was existing since 2005. For almost 10 years, that particular virus was in the system, ferreting out this information from the Indian computers and servers and uploading it on the servers in Shanghai and other parts of China. So since then, actually, we have taken multiple steps to protect our cyber infrastructure. We have the National Cybersecurity Policy, which came out in 2013. We also had the Information Technology Act in 2000, which was amended in 2008. And then we also have a National Cybersecurity Coordinator. And in the last 2 years, we have seen two new developments. One is that the Ministry of Home Affairs has set up a National Cyber Crime Coordination Center, and the Indian military has set up a Tri-Service Command of the Defense Cyber Agency. So that really, has brought the various elements of cybersecurity, which is actually in line with the efforts which are being undertaken at a global level by various other states. But as I always say, and this actually comes from my background in the counterterrorism domain, which is that whereas the states have to be successful 100% when it comes to foiling a cyber attack or foiling a terrorist attack, but the perpetrator of the attack has to be successful only once, right? So that really, is a major challenge for us. That most of the times when we look at the cyber attacks, we think that the government is not doing enough, but that's also because the saboteurs have been successful at that particular time. But what we don't realize is that behind that one particular successful cyber attack, there'll be countless other cyber attacks which have been foiled, which have been neutralized by the establishment.
Yes,
Okay, thank you,
next
sir.
question, please. Yes, come on, be quick.
Hello, sir.
Thanks.
Good evening. This is Diya Kapoor. I'm studying BA in International Relations. So my question is, sir, if somebody is found guilty of somebody in the sense somebody or some country is found guilty in the case of cyber attack, so what will be the punishment or the consequence for them as of now?
So there are multiple ways in which states have sought to respond to these kind of things. One normal way, or should I say normal, one usual way in which the states have responded is actually by launching the retaliatory cyber attacks. So that happened in case of the Stuxnet virus, that when the United States and Israeli hackers targeted the Iranian nuclear program and successfully slowed down the Iranian nuclear operations. The Iranian hackers hit out not at the United States or Israel, but at one of the other key ally of the United States, which is Saudi Arabia. And they actually launched an attack on the Saudi oil company, Aramco. Similarly, in 2014, when the North Korean hackers got into the Sony servers because Sony was producing a movie on the North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, the hackers really breached the Sony computers and stole data from the Sony servers. In response, when the United States found out it was the North Korean-based hackers, the United States launched a cyber attack on North Korea and shut down that country's internet for 3 days. So mostly we have seen the retaliatory cyber attacks coming in by the states when it comes to cyber attacks. Or should I say, two other measures which have developed recently is one is that when it comes to the data breaches and cyber attacks, some countries have also brought sanctions to deal with these perpetrators. So once they find out who has carried out the attack, United States and Europe actually have, the European Union have actually imposed sanctions on the perpetrators. So in 2020, we saw European Union sanctioning some of the Chinese, Russian, and North Korean hackers, as well as the intelligence officials, which it believed were responsible for multiple cyber attacks on the European computer networks. Similarly, the United States also sanctioned the Chinese and the Russian hackers for the cyber attacks on the American computer networks. So those are the non-military ways in which the states have responded. When it comes to non-state actors, there is at least one military response which has developed, which is that countries like Israel have actually resorted to a military retaliation. So in 2019, Israel actually bombed the technology division of the Gaza, of the Hamas terrorist group in Gaza in retaliation for previous cyber attacks, as well as in retaliation for a future cyber attack that the Hamas was planning on the Israeli computer networks. So there are multiple ways in which the states have responded, which again brings back to the question as to that if this is how the states are going to respond, then there should be certain rules for responsible state behavior in the cyberspace.
Thank you.
Yes. Next question.
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Firstly, sir, thank you for this session. My name is Yashvi Barot, and I'm a final year BA student from St. Xavier's College, Mumbai. So my question is much more directed as a student who is unaware of this topic and just has very surface knowledge about it. Don't you think that a lot of Indian universities don't have a special course on cyber diplomacy or cyber security in general? Because if we are not aware about it, we won't be able to understand the situation quite comprehensively. So how do you think on the academic side India should have courses on cybersecurity, cyber diplomacy to educate everyone that this is one of the major security threats and this will just aggravate in the near future?
So thank you for the very relevant question. I would say at least in the last 2 years, we have seen a concerted attempt by the academic community as well as the think tank community to elevate the understanding about the cybersecurity issues. I have seen some central universities in various states actually introducing a special center on cyber and emerging technologies to look at these issues of cyber security as well as the technology related questions which actually affect the national security. I have also seen, for instance, the Central University of Gujarat, which has actually introduced a course called as Cyber Shield, which will basically make the students aware about not just the cyber security, but in terms of also cyber hygiene, that in what ways we should protect ourselves on the internet and cyberspace. And one other thing which has also happened recently is that many technical universities or the forensic universities have actually upgraded their capacity in terms of cyber forensics. So they're actually offering the courses to the students on cyber forensics. Obviously, this is at a higher education level. So you can say masters and beyond, not necessarily at undergraduate level. But I'm sure that once our efforts get stabilized in that particular domain, they would trickle down to the other lower levels also.
Definitely, sir. So thank you for responding. Also, sir, I just wanted to ask a follow-up that regarding cyber security, cyber diplomacy, can anyone enroll for it, or is it forms a part of any paper, say for international relations masters in IR, or does it form a part of it, or how is it?
Yes, it is actually, because we don't have that kind of academic capacity in terms of making this a separate discipline as such. But in many universities, it is actually part of a larger course. So if you do masters, let's say national security, or masters in just the security studies, it will be part of one of the courses.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
Yes. Next question. Come on. Be quick.
Hello, good evening, sir. Good evening, sir.
Let's go.
Yes, hi.
Yeah.
Please.
So I have a question like,
Introduce yourself first.
so this is Akhilesh Dwivedi, a doctoral student of Defense and Strategic Studies from Kanpur University. So I have got a question like, is it possible that this cyber diplomacy could create more fruitful international environment, leading to better international footholds and greater facility in the attainment of national interest?
So actually, it depends on the relations between the major powers, because there are very few countries which do have access to this technology and who are very conversant with this technology. So unless those countries actually sort out the differences, which is in this case, as I've been saying repeatedly, if the US, if the United States, Russia, and China can actually sort out their differences when it comes to cyberspace, it will bring a lot of stability to the cyberspace itself, and that actually can create a conducive environment for other domains of the international security, which is that if these countries can actually other countries will think that if these three countries which are adversaries can actually come together and evolve a certain regime for the stability of cyberspace, then actually it is possible for us to also engage in international collaboration to address our security concerns. But at a point where we are now currently, given what is happening in Ukraine, given what is happening in Taiwan, and other places, I think, and plus the US-China tensions, I think it will be certain some time before we can actually say with some confidence that these three countries can come together.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, next question. Come on. We can't detain Dr. Samir for long. Yes. Any more questions? And if there are no questions, then yeah. Be quick.
Yes. Yes. So my question is kind of
Introduce yourself.
I introduced myself earlier. Again, I will do it. Hello, sir. Diya Kapoor again. I'm a student of BA International Relations. So I kind of have a question from different aspects about the cyber security. So what if I agree our government stores the data and all the stuff. What if our government starts to spy on us and we feel threatened by it? In that case, what we can do? I mean, there should be some rules and laws for us. Is there any laws and rules right now? I'm not talking about future. I want right now.
So it's a very difficult question that you asked, but I think there's a very simple answer to it, that that despite the fact that the Supreme Court has recognized the right to privacy as a fundamental right, successive Indian governments actually have not taken it in their stride to actually enact statutory legislation on the right to privacy. By right to privacy, I would mean first define what is right to privacy, define what are the violations of it, define which are the agencies which can carry out the surveillance on or legal surveillance on its citizens, and fourth, which is that if there is a violation of this right to privacy, what kind of grievance redressal mechanisms the citizen would have. I think unfortunately we have not seen any progress on this particular front, which is really tragic, because for a very long time I have been arguing, given the fact that I'm come from the national security background, is that the absence of the right to privacy is actually impairing even the genuine surveillance which is needed for counterterrorism purposes and for national security purposes. So the fact that the state is going on and targeting, let's say, the human rights activists and the civil society activists through this illegal surveillance, actually is impairing the cause of the genuine surveillance. And therefore, for the longest period of time, I have been saying that India really needs to enact the right to privacy. But just to answer your question, I think we are nowhere near that, and I think for the foreseeable future, we will not be seeing any progress on that.
Yes, correct me if I'm wrong. The earlier Pegasus controversy was something related to this matter, right, sir?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Dr. Samir, like a student, I would like to put a query to you. I mean, Aadhaar and PAN, these are the two very important, you can say, cards for identification. Don't you think the PAN itself is sufficient for identification? Why Aadhaar?
So I think Aadhaar becomes
How
important
Aadhaar?
for the. So Aadhaar actually becomes important for the kind of data that it holds, which is the biometric data. So the PAN card
Okay.
does not have the biometric data, which is why the government is insisting on the Aadhaar data, because
Yeah.
because the biometric data cannot be forged, right? So
Yeah.
therefore, it becomes much more secure way of identifying someone than just the PAN card data.
Yeah. No, Dr. Sabir, but I see, I read in the newspaper that every now and then these, false Aadhaar cards are being made of the foreigners in India. I know in Delhi, I don't want to name a particular country. A lot of, domestic maids and, these guards, they come from that particular country and they very easily get a Aadhaar card. Can this practice be, checked and all that? They have a valid Aadhaar card and they can have an account opened in any bank in Delhi and they can do their business. So what is so special about this Aadhaar card for Indians? When any foreigners can pay and bribe, unscrupulous people to prepare this Aadhaar card and all that.
So that's actually the lacuna of this implementation program, because we have seen, as you've been seeing, these instances of the fake ID cards Aadhaar cards being made. But I think that is why actually now the government is also linking it to the PAN card, which is that, and therefore, for instance, you would see that anyone who files IT returns, actually also has to enter the Aadhaar card, and that really establishes the identity of the person. And the second thing is, even though, so Aadhaar is not, I would say, is not a panacea for everything. So even though there are certain instances of the fake Aadhaar cards or the forged Aadhaar cards being made, the government has now sought to bring Aadhaar card at the level of other documents also, where there is a much stricter way of making the cards. But having said all that, I think it is not just a problem with Aadhaar. It is, I think, the problem with every government ID, that no matter how much soever you make the system secure, you would still have the instances of the forged cards or the things we made. For instance, passport, right? Passport, you would say that that it is one of the most secure systems, because it actually establishes not just the citizenship but also the right of the citizens to actually go and travel abroad. But we have seen the instances of the fake passports also being made. So that, I think, is a perennial challenge, and not just for India, by the way. I think it is the world over.
I was just coming to that, but you have already pointed out about the passport and all that. that is the problems that are there, and some solution has got to be there. So, Dr. Samir, thank you very much for enlightening us on a very difficult subject. I think you have explained in very simple terms, and I think the students should have understood what the cyber security is and how to safeguard our rights and all that, and what India has done, as a diplomatic initiative. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
We hope we will have to have your, cooperation and contribution when we feel that time has come and things are needs to be updated. And when you bring out with your next book, we will invite you. Okay, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.